The dense fog clung to the tall trees like a shroud, wrapping the forest in an eternal, oppressive silence. It was the kind of silence that suffocated all other sounds, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, even the hum of insects, drowned by an eerie stillness. Karl Richter, a young researcher of folklore and obscure legends, had always believed in the power of stories, but never truly feared them. That was before he found himself standing at the edge of the forest known only as the Wald der Vergessenen, the Forest of the Forgotten. It was an old place, older than any map could describe, nestled deep in the heart of Eastern Europe, where the shadows of history hung thick in the air. Rumors surrounded the woods, tales of travelers who entered but never returned, and of an ancient song that could be heard at twilight, a melody that promised oblivion to any who dared to listen. But Karl, driven by his curiosity and a thirst for truth, had scoffed at these stories. He was a man of science, a seeker of answers, not a man to be swayed by superstition. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the path grew narrower, the trees more twisted and gnarled, as if they themselves had become twisted by time. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the forest seemed to close in around him as though it was watching him, waiting. There was no sign of wildlife, no birds overhead, no rustling in the underbrush. Only the faint sound of his own footsteps against the earth, and then, a sound that stopped him in his tracks. It was faint at first, like the wind whispering through the trees, but there was something unmistakably melodic about it. A woman's voice, soft and haunting, drifting on the breeze. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, but there was something unsettling about it, like a lullaby sung to a child moments before an unseen hand reached out to snatch them away. Karl stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He had heard of the song, of course. The forest curse, the thing that drew people in and never let them leave. But he never expected to hear it himself, never thought it would actually come to him, calling to him in such a way. He should turn back. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to turn around, to forget the song, to escape before it was too late. But something deeper than reason, compelled him forward. He wasn't afraid. He was curious, driven by the need to understand. The voice grew louder, clearer, more distinct, though still distant. There was no question now, he had to follow it. With each step, the forest seemed to change. The trees, once towering and forbidding, now seemed to bend toward him, their branches twisting and reaching as though guiding him along the path. The fog thickened, making it harder to see, but the song cut through the haze like a beacon. Karl quickened his pace, the song leading him further into the heart of the forest, where the air grew colder and the shadows deeper. And then, as though the world itself held its breath, the forest opened into a clearing. The trees parted, revealing a small, dilapidated cottage at the center, its windows dark and its roof caving in with age. The song came from within. Karl approached the cottage cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard of cursed places, of homes where the souls of the lost lingered, trapped in an eternal loop. But the voice, was it human? Was it even real? Or was it a trick of the mind, a lure to bring him deeper into the forest's web? He stepped closer, each footfall echoing in the silence until he reached the door. Hesitating only for a moment, he pushed it open. The interior was dimly lit by a faint, ghostly glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. In the center of the room, kneeling on the floor, was a woman. Her long, disheveled hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of black silk, and her clothes, torn and faded with time, looked as though they belonged to another era altogether. She sang softly, her voice trembling with emotion as she repeated the same haunting melody over and over again. At first, Karl couldn't move. He was frozen, captivated by the sight of her, and then by the sense that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her eyes, he could see them now, were not looking at him. They were unfocused, as if trapped in some unseen void. There was no recognition in them, only the hollow emptiness of someone lost to time. "Who are you?" Karl whispered, though his voice seemed swallowed by the oppressive silence of the room. The woman's voice faltered, and she slowly turned her head toward him. Her gaze was distant, but her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, help me." It was then that Karl understood. She wasn't just singing. She was trapped in a curse, trapped in a never-ending loop of time. The song was not a lullaby, it was a plea for release, a cry for salvation. She was the key to the mystery of this place, and she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to come and break the cycle. But Karl could not have known what he was about to face. He had stepped into a web of ancient magic, and the forest would not let him go without a price. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, Karl realized that escaping the forest was not just a matter of turning back. It was a matter of breaking the curse. Karl could feel the weight of the forest pressing against him, as though it were alive, breathing in sync with his own heartbeat. The moment the woman spoke, her fragile whisper seemed to shake the very air around him. She was real, but her presence felt unnatural, like a shadow from another time, a being caught between the worlds of the living and the dead. "Please, help me," she said again, her voice a soft, tremulous sigh that barely rose above the eerie hum of the forest. It was a plea, a cry for deliverance from an unimaginable torment. But as Karl looked into her eyes, he saw nothing but a hollow emptiness, as if her soul had been drained, leaving behind only the form of a woman trapped in a nightmare. He took a step closer, instinctively reaching out as though he could comfort her, but something held him back. The air in the cottage grew colder, a sharp chill that sliced through him like ice. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. There was something wrong here, something beyond the woman's obvious suffering. The forest itself seemed to be watching, waiting for his next move. "Who are you?" Karl asked, his voice breaking the silence, though he could barely hear it over the low hum that filled the room. "What happened to you?" The woman did not respond immediately. She continued to hum that same haunting melody, her voice trembling with sorrow and despair. Her gaze drifted to the walls of the cottage, where strange symbols were carved into the wood, their sharp, jagged lines pulsing with an unnatural energy. The symbols seemed to writhe in the dim light, as though alive, shifting and changing with each passing second. Karl felt a chill race up his spine as he glanced at the symbols. He had seen similar marks in the old manuscripts he studied back at his university, but never this vivid, never this active. They were ancient sigils, used in rites long forgotten, some of which were said to bind the living to the realm of the dead. The curse was older than he had imagined. "Why are you here?" he pressed, stepping closer again, despite the growing sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. "What happened to this place?" The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but her words were a jumble of disjointed phrases, as if she were trapped in a loop, forced to relive the same events over and over. She stopped singing for a moment, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of something like recognition, or was it terror? "You don't understand?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was never meant to be." Karl leaned in, straining to hear her, but the words she spoke next sent a shock through him. "They were all sacrificed." The word hit him like a punch to the gut. Sacrificed? Oh, to what? Karl's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information he had gathered from the old tales of the forest. The stories spoke of a village, long abandoned, where people had once made a pact with an ancient force, an entity older than the forest itself. But the stories were just that, stories, legends to frighten children and warn travelers. They couldn't be real. But here, in this decaying cottage, with the woman trapped in her endless torment, it was becoming clear. The curse was not just a superstition. It was a terrible reality. Karl's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that slammed the door shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew thicker, the shadows pressing in closer, as if the very walls of the cottage were closing around him. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. He turned toward the door, but the woman's voice stopped him. "Don't go," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "The forest won't let you leave. You have to help me first." Before Karl could respond, the growl grew louder and the temperature in the room dropped even further. He could see his breath misting in the cold air. The woman's face twisted in agony as she clutched her head, as though some unseen force were tormenting her mind. The symbols on the walls pulsed again, brighter now, their jagged lines cutting through the darkness. Without warning, the room began to shake. The floorboards creaked and the walls groaned as if the entire cottage were alive. Karl stumbled back, his heart racing in his chest. He reached for the door, but it was no use. The handle had melted into the wood, sealed shut by some unseen force. The air grew heavy, and the growl became a screeching wail, deafening in its intensity. Then through the chaos he saw it. A figure materialized in the corner of the room, its shape shifting and flickering in the dim light. It was tall, its form vaguely human but distorted, as though it were made of shadows and smoke. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly fire, and its mouth opened in a twisted grin. The entity, if it could be called that, stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Karl felt his legs grow weak, his mind clouded by an overwhelming sense of dread. He had read about creatures like this, ancient spirits bound by blood and ritual, capable of bending the very fabric of reality to their will. But to see one in person was something else entirely. "You are too late," the figure said, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to crawl under Karl's skin. "The woman is mine. She has always been mine." Karl's breath caught in his throat. "What do you want with her? What is this place?" The entity's grin widened. "She is the key. She is the sacrifice, the one who will bind this world to ours. She was chosen long ago, and now she will fulfill her role." A surge of anger coursed through Karl's veins. He had come here seeking answers, but he hadn't expected to find this malevolent force, this creature feeding off the pain and suffering of the woman before him. He couldn't let it continue. He couldn't just walk away. "Why her?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fear and defiance. "What does she have to do with all of this?" The figure paused, its fiery eyes narrowing. "She was born of the bloodline. Her ancestors made the pact, and she was chosen to carry it to its bitter end." Karl's mind raced. Bloodline? A pact? The woman? Who was she really? What had her ancestors done? Before he could process the revelation, the entity lunged at him, its form melting into the air like smoke. He staggered back, barely managing to avoid its grasp. The air seemed to pulse with energy, and the symbols on the walls flared with an intense, blinding light. Karl was running out of time. He had to act. In the corner of his mind, a thought sparked. The woman, she was the key. If he could break the curse, if he could somehow free her from the endless cycle of torment, then maybe he could break the entity's power as well. He turned to her, his voice filled with urgency. "You have to fight it. You have to remember. You're not just a sacrifice." But the woman's eyes remained vacant, her voice a soft whisper as she began to hum the song again, the melody reverberating through the room, deep into the core of his being. It was too late for reason. With his heart pounding, Karl reached for the symbols on the walls, his hands shaking as he tried to decipher their meaning. He needed to break the curse. He needed to free her. The forest was not just a place, it was alive and it was hungry. The battle for their lives had only just begun. The cottage trembled as though the earth itself were convulsing beneath it. The growls from the shadows reverberated through Karl's chest, a gnawing, oppressive sound that seemed to twist the very air into something thick and suffocating. Every heartbeat thundered in his ears, and the woman's song, the cursed, haunting lullaby, pulled at his soul, threatening to drag him into madness. But he couldn't give in. Not yet. The entity that loomed before him seemed to be both everywhere and nowhere, its form fluctuating, flickering between reality and the darkness. Its grin was wide, cruel, a macabre display of jagged teeth that gleamed with an unnatural hunger. Its fiery eyes burned into Karl's mind, and for a moment, it felt like the creature could see right through him, to the deepest, most vulnerable parts of his thoughts. Karl gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. The woman, she was his only hope, the only chance to break the curse. But her eyes, those vacant eyes, held nothing but despair. She was lost. Lost to something far older, far more powerful than anything he could comprehend. But Karl couldn't just stand there and watch her fade. He had to act, had to find a way to reach her. He looked back at the symbols carved into the walls, their jagged edges glowing with a sickly light. The marks were pulsating now, alive, as though the curse itself were coursing through the room. Every pulse seemed to send a shockwave through the air, making Karl's skin prickle with a terrible sense of foreboding. The creature's laughter echoed in his ears, a sound so chilling that it made his blood run cold. "You can't break the cycle," the entity hissed, its voice a rasping whisper that echoed from every corner of the room. "She belongs to me, and you will die here, just like the rest of them." Karl's heart raced, but his mind refused to yield. He remembered the old texts he had studied, the arcane rituals that spoke of breaking curses, of binding spirits, of severing the ties that bound the living to the dead. The answer had to be in those symbols. It had to be. The woman's song grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. He pressed his hands against the wall, tracing the glowing symbols with his fingers, trying to find some kind of pattern, some clue that could help him unlock the curse. But the more he touched the symbols, the more they burned, sending jolts of pain through his body. It was as if the very essence of the forest was fighting against him, trying to drag him deeper into the darkness. Then something in the air shifted. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the walls, and Karl felt a sudden chill crawl down his spine. The ground beneath him trembled, and the woman's voice cracked, her humming turning into a desperate, broken cry. "No," she whispered, her hands clutching her head as though trying to tear at the very fabric of her own mind. "No, please. I can't. I can't stop it." Karl's breath caught in his throat. The curse was taking hold of her again. It was pulling her deeper into the loop, tightening its grip, feeding on her suffering. But then, something shifted in her expression. Something faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her eyes, once empty, now held a flicker of recognition. A flicker of humanity. "Karl," she whispered, her voice fragile, as if speaking his name were an effort. He leaned in, his hands shaking as he cupped her face, his fingers brushing against the cold, clammy skin of her cheeks. "I'm here. I'm going to help you. You have to remember. You have to fight it." The woman's lips trembled, her eyes unfocused again. But for a brief moment, Karl saw the faintest glimmer of something that felt like hope. Then the entity's growl shattered the moment, a deafening sound that seemed to rip through the very fabric of reality. The shadows in the room surged forward, coalescing into a shape, a monstrous, twisted figure that seemed to be made of pure darkness. Its form was vast, towering over Karl like a mountain, and its eyes glowed with an infernal fire that threatened to burn everything in its path. "No!" Karl shouted, stepping in front of the woman, his heart hammering in his chest. "I won't let you have her." The creature's laughter echoed, a chilling sound that reverberated in the very marrow of his bones. "You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. You are but a fleeting moment in time. And she is mine." Karl's pulse quickened, his mind racing. There had to be a way. He couldn't give up now. He couldn't let her become another soul lost to the forest. Then it came to him, the song. The melody that had lured him here in the first place. The woman's voice, her singing, was not just a signal of her torment. It was a tether. A link to the curse itself. If he could sever that link, if he could disrupt the song, he might be able to break the cycle. But how? Without thinking, Karl stepped forward, placing his hands on the woman's shoulders, his fingers digging into the fabric of her clothes. "You have to stop singing," he urged, his voice desperate. "Stop singing. You're feeding it. You're feeding the curse." The woman's eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the weight of the forest pressing in, the creature's growls fading into the background. And then she closed her eyes. Her lips parted and the song stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Karl's heart raced and he felt a faint glimmer of hope. But the silence was not to last. The walls of the cottage began to crack, deep fissures splitting the wood like the sound of thunder. The temperature plummeted even further, and Karl felt an icy hand wrap around his heart, squeezing with a pressure that threatened to crush him. The ground beneath his feet began to crack open, and from the depths of the earth, a terrible force rose, a black, writhing mass of shadows and malice. The entity roared in fury, its form swelling, expanding as though the very forest itself were pouring into the room. "You cannot defy me," it screamed, its voice shaking the cottage to its foundation. "You cannot escape what was meant to be." But Karl didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He reached deep into the pit of his mind, pulling forth the old rituals, the incantations that had been buried in forgotten texts, half-remembered spells that spoke of binding and severing, of undoing ancient wrongs. His hands shook as he traced the final symbol on the wall, the words of power flowing from his lips in a language older than the forest itself. The air hummed with energy, crackling and popping like static. The entity screamed as the symbols on the walls flared to life, their jagged edges glowing with an intense light. The shadows recoiled, twisting violently as the power of the curse was unraveled, strand by strand. And then, with a deafening roar, the creature was gone. The forest fell silent. Karl stood, panting, his body shaking with exhaustion. He turned to the woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. The curse had been broken. The entity was gone. But the forest remained. The shadows still lingered, waiting as if they had never truly left. "We're not out yet," Karl said, his voice hoarse. "We have to leave. Now." Together they turned toward the door. And as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they stepped into the clearing, leaving the shadows of the past, and the horrors of the forest, behind them. The sun was still a thin thread of light on the horizon, casting a pale glow across the forest as Karl and the woman stumbled toward the clearing. Each step felt like a defiance of the nightmare they had just narrowly escaped, but the silence around them was unsettling, almost too peaceful after the chaos they had endured. The weight of the forest, the oppressive darkness that had once surrounded them, seemed to be receding, but Karl could feel it still, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. He glanced over at the woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and distant, as though she were still lost somewhere in the spaces between the world of the living and the realm they had just escaped. She had stopped humming, but the echoes of her song still hung in the air, like the residue of a haunting dream. She wasn't truly free, not yet. The curse might have been broken, but its mark on her soul was not so easily erased. "You're safe now," Karl said gently, his voice softer than he intended. "We're getting out of here. The curse is lifted. You're—" But the woman's lips trembled and she turned toward him, her eyes flashing with something dark, something that hadn't been there before. Her fingers twitched as though trying to reach for something in the air, something just out of her grasp. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice trembling with an unfamiliar edge. "It's not over. I can still feel it." Karl's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The woman's eyes glowed faintly, her pupils dilated as though the light itself was foreign to her. She took a hesitant step backward, her breath shallow and quick. "The forest, it's alive, Karl. It has been alive all along. And it will not let me go. Not now. Not ever." Karl frowned, his mind racing. He had thought that breaking the curse would be the end of it, that the terror would dissipate like the last remnants of a storm. But her words cut through him, sharp as a knife. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, subtly at first, then with more force. The earth groaned as though something deep below was awakening. Karl turned his head, his eyes scanning the shadowed trees. The air felt thick, too thick, heavy with an unseen presence. The forest itself seemed to breathe, exhaling its chilling mist into the morning air. "What is it?" Karl asked, his voice low, heart racing. The woman's eyes widened in terror as she took a step closer to him. "It wasn't just the entity. The forest, it was the one who called to me. Wanted me. All these years I was its prisoner. The curse was its means of holding me in place, but it never truly let go." She paused, swallowing hard, her voice trembling as if she were speaking against the pull of something unseen. "I was never meant to leave. And now, it wants me back." Before Karl could respond, a gust of wind howled through the trees, sharper and colder than before, and the earth beneath them seemed to split open, revealing deep fissures that ran through the soil like veins. The air became heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something foul like decay. The woman gasped and dropped to her knees, clutching her chest as though the very air was crushing her. "I can feel it. It's here, it's inside me." Karl rushed to her side, kneeling down, gripping her arm. "No. No, this can't be happening. We broke the curse. You're free." But as he touched her, a violent tremor ran through her body, and she screamed, an ear-splitting, guttural scream that echoed through the forest like a death knell. Her body contorted, her face twisting in agony, her eyes rolling back in her head. Karl tried to pull her to her feet, but it was as though the forest itself had latched onto her, pulling her down into the earth. The trees groaned again, their branches shaking violently as if they were alive, reaching out for her. "No. No!" Karl shouted, panic clawing at him. He yanked her toward him, trying desperately to pull her out of the grasp of the forest, but it was no use. The earth was beginning to swallow her, her body sinking into the ground. Her voice, now a strangled whisper, broke through the cacophony of the forest's screams. "Karl, it won't let me go." Karl's mind raced, frantic. He had no time. There had to be something, some way to stop this. He had already broken the curse. He had done everything he could. But the forest was not done with them yet. Looking down at the woman, Karl's eyes caught something, a glint of metal buried in the dirt next to her. It was an old pendant, one he recognized from earlier in the cottage, when he had first touched the symbols on the wall. The pendant had been a part of the ritual, a key to the curse. Karl's pulse quickened as he reached for the pendant, his fingers trembling as he pulled it from the soil. The moment his hand closed around the cold metal, the forest seemed to react, the trees groaning louder, the earth rumbling beneath him. "Get away from her." The voice was not his own. It was ancient, deep, resonant, and full of rage. It came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating the very air around them. The ground shook with enough force to knock Karl off balance. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the pendant in his hand. He had no time to think, only to act. The woman's body convulsed violently, her eyes flashing open again. They were no longer human, no longer the eyes of the woman he had tried to save. They were dark, endless voids that seemed to pull the light from the world around her. Karl's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't have much time. The entity's power was still there, festering beneath the earth, pulling at the woman, wanting her to return to the forest's grasp. He pressed the pendant against her chest, whispering the incantation he had memorized from the ancient texts. The last words that could sever the link between her and the forest forever. The moment the pendant touched her skin, the forest screamed, a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath them. The woman's body arched in pain, her mouth opening in a silent scream, her arms flailing as if caught in an invisible grip. The ground beneath her began to crack open, and Karl felt the overwhelming force of the forest trying to drag her back down into its depths. But Karl held fast. He tightened his grip on the pendant, pressing it harder into her chest. "You are not its prisoner anymore," he shouted. "This is over. You are free." For a moment everything stopped. The earth stilled. The trees fell silent. The wind stopped howling. Then the woman's body went limp, and Karl was thrown backward as a surge of energy erupted from her, knocking him to the ground. The pendant glowed with an eerie light, casting shadows that danced across the forest as if they had a life of their own. The air crackled with an unnatural energy. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it was over. The woman lay still in the clearing, her body peaceful now, the storm that had raged within her finally quelled. The earth beneath her began to heal, the cracks sealing themselves as if they had never been. Karl stood slowly, his body sore and bruised, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared down at the woman, her face now calm, the dark voids in her eyes gone, replaced with the faintest glimmer of life. The curse was over. But the forest was not. The trees still loomed, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands as though watching them. The ground beneath Karl's feet still felt unnaturally heavy, as though it remembered the dark presence that had once thrived within it. He turned to the woman who was now stirring, blinking as if waking from a long, endless sleep. Her eyes were full of confusion, but she no longer looked haunted. "It's over," Karl whispered. But the forest did not agree. Not yet. It was still watching. The first rays of daylight spilled over the treetops, casting a muted glow across the forest as Karl helped the woman to her feet. Despite the stillness around them, the tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the forest, though seemingly freed from the curse, was holding its breath, waiting for something. The ancient trees, their gnarled limbs reaching toward the sky, no longer seemed like passive witnesses. They felt like watchers waiting for the next move, the next transgression. The woman leaned against Karl, her legs unsteady as she tried to regain her strength. Her face was pale, her eyes dull, as though the events of the last few hours had torn something inside of her, something irreparable. The song, the curse, the forest, it was as though a part of her soul had been left behind, trapped in the dark fold of time that had once held her captive. "Are you all right?" Karl asked, his voice soft yet filled with an edge of concern. He had no idea if she was truly free or if the remnants of the forest still clung to her, hidden beneath the surface like a parasite. She nodded, though her gaze remained distant, unfocused. "I don't know," she swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "I feel like I'm waking from a dream, but the dream hasn't ended. The forest? It never really leaves, does it?" Karl's eyes flicked back to the trees. No, it didn't leave. He could feel it too, the low hum in the ground, the strange magnetic pull that seemed to claw at his skin. The forest had been alive long before they arrived, and it would be long after they were gone. Whatever force had governed it, whatever ancient power resided in its depths, had not been fully undone. There was still something wrong. He glanced at the woman. "We need to leave," he said. "It's not safe here. If the curse isn't fully broken, the forest might." Before he could finish, there was a rustling sound, a soft, almost imperceptible movement in the underbrush. His heart skipped a beat as his head whipped toward the sound, but he saw nothing. Only shadows moving in the corners of his vision, shifting unnaturally as though the forest itself were alive, aware of their presence. The woman's breath hitched beside him and Karl turned back to her. Her face had gone ashen, her pupils dilated as she stared ahead. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Karl's eyes narrowed. "I heard it," he said, his hand instinctively going to the knife strapped to his belt. But even as he gripped it, he knew that a blade wouldn't be enough. Whatever had survived the curse, whatever was still watching them, was far older, far more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. There was no time to hesitate. "Come on," Karl urged, his voice firm as he helped the woman toward the edge of the clearing. They had to keep moving. They had to get out of the forest before whatever dark force lingered fully awakened. They had taken only a few steps when the sound came again, closer this time, the rustling of something large moving through the underbrush, its presence unmistakable. And then voices. Whispers, faint at first but rising slowly in volume. The language was strange, guttural, ancient. Karl's heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the words. but they were a jumble, twisted fragments of speech that only heightened the sense of dread gnawing at his gut. "Run!" the woman cried, her voice breaking as she turned and staggered toward him, her feet unsteady. It was too late. The trees around them seemed to shift, bending in unnatural ways, their trunks groaning under an unseen weight. From the shadows emerged figures, tall, gaunt, their faces hidden beneath hoods of tattered black cloth. Their movements were jerky, as though they were not quite alive, not quite dead. And their eyes, pale, empty eyes, locked onto Karl and the woman with a predatory hunger that made his skin crawl. The woman gasped, her eyes widening in terror as she tried to pull away from Karl, but her body wouldn't cooperate. It was as if some invisible force had taken hold of her, rooting her to the spot. "They're here," she whispered, her voice choked. "They've come. They were waiting for me." Karl's chest tightened. He looked around, his senses on high alert as the figures closed in. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like hunters circling their prey. The whispers were growing louder now, filling the air, and Karl could feel the forest pressing in on them, tightening around them like a vice. The ground beneath their feet began to shift again, cracking open in jagged lines as dark tendrils snaked from the earth, wrapping themselves around the woman's legs, pulling her downward. Karl reached for her, but the tendrils were too strong, and with a terrifying screech, they dragged her deeper into the ground. "No!" Karl screamed, his heart thundering in his chest as he lunged forward, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her free. But the more he struggled, the deeper she sank, the earth closing around her like a hungry maw. "Karl, it's too late," she cried, her voice barely audible over the sound of the forest's growing roar. "The forest, it will never let me go." With a final desperate tug, Karl yanked her free from the tendril's grasp, pulling her out of the earth with every ounce of strength he had. But even as he did, the shadows around them began to close in. The figures, these twisted, unnatural creatures, were moving faster now, closing the gap between them. Karl's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything that could save them. He knew they couldn't outrun the shadows. They couldn't fight them, not in the way they had fought the entity. The forest wasn't something that could be defeated with a knife or a spell, it was something far darker, far more insidious. It had always been here. It had always been watching. The woman clutched Karl's arm, her grip desperate as she trembled beside him. "Karl," she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "I can still feel it. The pull, it wants me back. The forest, it's not just the curse. It's the heart of it. It feeds on us. On me." Karl looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to leave. We can't stay here, not with them so close." But the woman shook her head, her eyes distant. "No, Karl. It's not that simple. The forest, it's in me. I can feel it, its heartbeat inside my chest. It's always been inside me." Before he could respond, the ground beneath them gave way with a deafening crack. Karl's body was thrown forward, the woman's scream echoing in his ears as they tumbled into the blackness below. The world around them spun, the air thick with the stench of decay as they fell deeper into the earth. The shadows, those twisted figures, were following them, their eyes burning with hunger, their whispers rising in a maddening crescendo. And then everything went dark. But as they fell, Karl felt a terrible truth settling within him. A truth that no matter how far they ran, no matter what they did, they were still in the forest's grip. And the forest would never let them go. The ground beneath them trembled once more, as if the very heartbeat of the forest had quickened. Karl felt the vibrations travel through his legs, a cold dread creeping up his spine. The air had become dense, filled with a sharp, metallic tang that seemed to cling to his lungs with each breath. Above, the sky was growing darker, as if the sun itself were being swallowed by the forest. The woman, still standing by the altar, her expression haunted, stared at Karl with eyes filled with fear, yet also something deeper, something almost resigned. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "We shouldn't have come here. We never should have broken the curse." Karl's mind raced. They had broken the curse. At least that was what he had thought. But this was different. This wasn't just a simple spell, an ancient curse trapped in time. This was something far older, something far more primal. The forest itself was a living entity, a being of pure, unbridled power. And the woman, she wasn't merely its prisoner. She was its tether, its anchor. "Stay close," Karl said, reaching out for her, his voice frantic. "We can still make it out. The forest, it's not invincible. We can fight it." But deep down he wasn't so sure. There was a part of him, a small voice that whispered, telling him that the forest had always been in control, that it had been waiting for this moment. For them to arrive. For the woman to break free, only to become its prisoner once again. As if to confirm his worst fears, the trees around them groaned louder, their twisted branches moving like fingers reaching for the sky. The shadows between the trunks seemed to deepen, as if the darkness itself was gathering. And then from the depths of the forest came a sound, soft at first but growing louder with every passing second. Was a song. A haunting, eerie melody that seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the trees like a lamentation. The woman's face twisted in terror. "It's here," she gasped. "It's singing again." Karl's heart pounded in his chest as the song wrapped around them, filling the air with an otherworldly resonance. It was familiar, the same song that had pulled her into the forest, the same song that had cursed her. But now it was different. It was louder, stronger. It felt as though the forest itself was breathing with the rhythm, drawing them in, surrounding them with its presence. He turned to the woman. "We have to leave. Now." But she was already stepping forward, moving toward the altar, her body swaying in time with the melody. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, blank, as though the song had claimed her once again. "No," Karl said, rushing to her side. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Don't. You can't." But her body stiffened, her head tilting slightly, as though she were listening to something beyond him. Something more important than his words. "It's calling me," she whispered, her voice distant. "I can't fight it. I never could." Karl felt his stomach drop. The forest was not letting go. It had never let go. Suddenly, the trees behind them cracked open, as if some immense force had shattered the barriers between the living world and the one beneath it. From the broken earth, dark tendrils of shadow emerged, wrapping themselves around the woman's body. The air grew cold, freezing Karl's breath in his lungs. "Let go of her," Karl shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. But the shadows didn't respond. They tightened their grip around the woman, pulling her closer to the altar, her body becoming more and more rigid as she was drawn into the embrace of the forest. The woman's lips parted in a final, strained whisper. "I'm sorry. I can't escape." And then, with a violent gust of wind, the shadows swallowed her whole, pulling her into the earth. The forest around them seemed to tremble with a final, resounding roar, as though it were claiming her once more, as though it were feeding on her very essence. The song grew louder, a cacophony of sorrow and rage that echoed through Karl's mind. His legs gave out beneath him as the last vestiges of the woman's presence faded into the air. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, unforgiving. Karl stood, his heart heavy with defeat. He had come here to free her, to break the curse that had held her captive. But he had failed. The forest had won. He looked around, realizing for the first time just how deeply he had been ensnared. The trees that had once seemed to sway with the rhythm of the song now stood still, watching him with a cold, lifeless gaze. The forest was alive, but it was dead. The curse, the song, the power, it was all part of the same thing. A cycle that had never ended and would never end. Karl's vision blurred as the weight of it all sank in. There was no escaping the forest. There was no escaping the curse. The wind picked up again, this time colder, biting. It whispered through the trees, but this time it wasn't just the wind. It was the forest speaking, reaching out, calling to him. It wasn't done yet. The song faded, but Karl knew it wasn't truly gone. It would always be there. The melody, the pull, the force that had trapped him here. With a final, ragged breath, Karl fell to his knees. He was a prisoner just as she had been. The forest had claimed them both. And as the darkness enveloped him, one final thought crossed his mind. This story, it never truly ends. This story is purely fictional and does not represent any real events.